How relevant is the non-aligned movement? The second largest organization of its kind after the United Nations meets in Uganda. But what problems can it solve in a world marred by escalating tension? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. It's an organisation created almost 70 years ago during the Cold War era of bilateralism, far removed from the world we see now. As the non-aligned movement met in Uganda, it denounced Israel's war on Gaza and called for an immediate ceasefire. It also called for the eradication of poverty and the implementation of sustainable development. But how big a role can its 120 members, including developing powers like India, South Africa and Indonesia, play on the global stage? And how much influence do they have in creating a more multilateral system? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Paul Ging.
The non-aligned movement grew from the principles of the Bandung Conference in 1955. Many of the African and Asian states taking part in Indonesia were newly independent, then having more than 50% of the world's population. The conference paved the way for the creation of the non-aligned movement at the height of the Cold War. The movement was viewed as a way for countries to show their neutrality in the bilateral confrontation between NATO countries grouped around the United States and the Warsaw Pact nations of the Soviet Union. The NAM aimed to focus attention on the developing world, instead to create an alternative multilateral model of the globe, working to promote disarmament, decolonization and opposition to racism, most prominently apartheid in South Africa. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union and the emergence of what the NAM has viewed as a unilateral world dominated by the United States, the movement has redefined itself in opposition to what it sees as Western hegemony to try to fashion itself an ongoing, relevant role. The non-aligned movement has grown to include 120 member states. The Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, has taken over as leader for 3 years. Some analysts say the changes he faces are convincing member states to take a unified position on major global issues, while at the same time balancing their own interests and priorities. But the movement retains a desire to offer an alternative vision to the current global political order. Paul Ging, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, we have a global panel to speak about this global movement. In the Ugandan capital, Kampala, we have Nicholas Sengoba. He's a columnist for the Daily Monitor national newspaper. In the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, Endy Bayuni is a former editor of the Jakarta Post. And also in Kampala, where that summit's been taking place, Dima Khatib, director of the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story with us today. Nicholas, I'll start with you, as you are also there in Kampala. So let me ask you, in the face of two ongoing wars right now in Ukraine and Gaza, where great powers are involved, as well as what some have called a second Cold War between the US and China, what does it mean right now to the countries there in Kampala? What does it mean to be non-aligned?
In the face of these two wars, it's a very great test for what we mean and what we define as non-alignment. Because if there are global issues and there are powers that are contesting, we as the countries in the non-aligned movement, or the countries in the South, the most that we can do to show our viability is what is it that we can do in this sort of situation to influence the events that take place, especially in bringing about all these powers to sue for peace. Now, the challenge that we have as most of the countries in the non-aligned movement and the Global South is that we are still very dependent countries on, despite the fact that we speak about non-alignment, we speak about independence, we speak about, as the president of Uganda says, pro ourselves. most of the things that we do, we are simply following, and we can only make comments that, in effect, do not bind or do not have any, impact. For instance, now with the war in Gaza, South Africa has come out very, very clearly with this case of genocide. Now, there's a very big story there. One, because South Africa is one of the countries that we would call the big economies on the African continent and in the South. They're members of the BRICS and all that. So they can speak. Now, the rest of us, what can we do apart from make comments? There's nothing practical that we can do.
Nicholas, speaking of comments, we saw from the Kampala Declaration that came out after the summit a very clear political statement. The Kampala Declaration includes denouncing Israel's actions in Gaza, calling for an immediate ceasefire. Endy, let me bring you in here. I've been wondering around this idea between being non-aligned and being neutral. Does making a political statement against Israel then potentially align you against a great power like the United States?
Well, no. The answer is no. I think that the fact that the summit in Kampala came out with a statement denouncing Israel aggression in Gaza was widely expected. This is something that I think goes back to the history of the non-aligned movement, even going further back to the Bandung summit of Asia-Africa countries in 1955, where the principles laid down includes sovereignty and independence. And until now, there's one country that remains under occupation, and that is Palestine. And I think every summit of the non-aligned movement, Indonesia definitely insisted on having a statement with regard to the creation of an independent state of the Palestine. So that it was widely expected. But when it comes to talk about neutrality, non-alignment is not about neutrality, but it's actually about taking active part in finding solutions to the problems, but without aligning with one or the other power. Now we are seeing the emergence of a new Cold War, particularly between China and the United States. Certainly in the Indo-Pacific region, we are feeling it very strong. And then I think the countries are being expected to align with one or the other. And with China expanding its power to Africa and beyond, particularly through Belt and Road initiatives, I think that contestation between the two big powers are even growing, expanding. 2 years ago, China and Russia signed this unlimited strategic partnership, meaning that if one of them is being attacked, I think they would help the other. So basically, we are now entering into a new Cold War situation. And this is, I think, where the non-aligned movement, as moral voice, is very important. And a lot of expectation are being placed in the Kampala summit to come up with something to address this issue.
Endy, I want to talk a little bit more about what's been happening in the Asia-Pacific region in just a moment. But you mentioned something there about solving problems and the non-aligned movement being a moral voice. Dima, you work for the United Nations, and one of the biggest criticisms around the UN when it comes to the war on Gaza has been about the lack of ability at the UN Security Council. And I know obviously you're not involved with the Security Council, but I'm asking about the UN structure, the infrastructure of the UN as a whole, that there has been a complete inability to reach any kind of agreement. Obviously, there are veto powers at the Security Council. You've been at the summit there in Kampala, Dima, and I'm wondering about the conversations that have been taking place. How much of what's emerged, this strong political statement that we've seen on Gaza, how much of that has been in response, a counterpoint somewhat to the inaction that we've seen at the UN? The movement wants to try to find some kind of solution, to be a moral voice and make some kind of statement.
Thank you very much. Let me dwell a little bit on the Third South Summit that's taking place here, the discussions that are happening, and the declaration capturing the different elements that are being discussed. This is the importance of such a meeting. It's kind of reviving, if you will, the common agenda and the collective call for action across different topics, including issues related to the geopolitical situations, the different crises, but also the development issues. And this is where our role as Office for UN, the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, where we come in by not only listening to the different elements of discussions, but also by gearing our different services, whether it's support to the intergovernmental processes, or it is support to knowledge management and knowledge sharing, but also in terms of supporting the countries in undertaking South-South cooperation projects via the UN systems come into play. Hence our participation and active engagement. On the sidelines, there are different topics that are also at the heart of the discussions and that are affected by the different crises. As we speak right now, there is an ongoing discussion on trade challenges, trade issues, and the role of South-South cooperation in economic growth. So bottom line, what I'm trying to say here is that the call for action and the collective discussions do cover an array of issues, and I'm sure that the outcome document that they are, that the different countries, the group of 7 and China are putting together, they do cover that comprehensively, but they do also call for action. They do call for more solidarity among themselves, and they do call of a more unified response to the different development issues that are affected by many factors, including the crisis in different countries.
So, Dima, just to clarify for our viewers, there are actually 2 summits that have been taking place in Kampala. One was the summit of the non-aligned movement that's already wrapped up. We had something like 30 heads of state there for that. And Uganda has now taken the chair of that movement. Literally the next day, you're now at a summit, which is the Third South Summit. That's the G77 plus China. That's also a large number of developing countries, and that's also being chaired by Uganda, but it is a separate summit. A lot of the same issues being discussed, obviously sustainable development being very high up there. Before I let you go, though, I want to ask you, Dima, about UN reform specifically, because this is something that the non-aligned movement has been very vocal about since its inception. And just coming back to that first summit, I've been curious about whether or not there's any kind of unified position now. We're talking about a huge number of countries, and I know there's been a big push for greater representation, particularly for small states who perhaps wouldn't have their voices heard as loudly as others. Is there a broad consensus on what UN reform would look like in the eyes of the non-aligned movement?
I think the discussions are still going on, but this has been voiced, and you are totally right, to have an amplified voice for the smaller countries and to have reforms taking place. And this is something that the UN Secretary General has also referred to this morning in his statement. The discussions are ongoing. There is a majority of call for such actions to take place, rightly so. But it's still going on. Now, how would this translate into action remains to be seen, but there is a lot of conversions, if you will, around that.
I see you nodding there, Endy. Do you have a sense of what that agenda might entail?
Well, I mean, this UN reform has been, like you said, in the movement's agenda, and we don't see any progress. But I think the movement should continue to press with this demand, although we should be realistic that it's not going to happen anytime soon. But with more than 100 countries in the movement or the G77, they represent a collective voice. I understand it's difficult to bring a consensus with such a huge group. But again, this I think very much depends on the leadership of the movement. It's a rotating chairmanship for 3 years. And I think this is now really down to Uganda to make a difference in the movement. We don't have a lot of expectation, but I think the pressure from the Global South through G77 and through the non-aligned movement should continue.
So you mentioned there that Uganda will be chairing not only the non-aligned movement, but also the G77 in China. Obviously, Museveni and Uganda have a very big influence over the agenda and what's happening over the course of the next few years. Now, the non-aligned movement emerged from deep post-colonial roots, and there's always been a bit of a suspicion from the West. And I'm wondering, within the context of what's happened in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, how much that's influencing Museveni's agenda. What is the top of that agenda?
I'm afraid whatever agenda he has, I'm not really very optimistic. And my reason is that whether it is the G77 plus China or the non-aligned movement, what determines the way the North and generally the world looks at the way they look at Africa is what sort of states do we bring to the table? Are these viable states? You know very well, most of the countries in the global South and the non-aligned movement have some of the worst figures when you come to the global problems with disease, poverty, debt, issues to do with the ecology, and so on and so forth. We are the greatest producers of migrants in the world. And so all those things, the way the world looks at us is that we are really clients. They pay our debt, they pay for our economies, and in many cases, they even pay wages for our civil servants. Now, how then do we come as a force, however big the numbers are? How do we come as an effective force if we are still indebted, if we are still playing to the tune of the piper? So that is where the challenge we have. President Museveni is very good with facts, with figures, and he speaks very, very well. But at the end of the day, what we are looking at is how will the voice that he brings, after being for all the years that he has had in power, the influence he has in Africa and globally in general, what effect does that voice have if the countries that, quote unquote, he's leading are still recipients of aid, are still recipients of donation, are still, at the bottom end of the pecking order? That is where the problem is. How are we going to be taken seriously when the very next day we are going to be asking for aid, we are going to be asking for, all sorts of assistance? I have seen globally, when it comes to all these global organizations and conferences, African presidents do so well with their facts and figures. But then what happens after that? So we lend a lot of gravitas to many of these things. He's the chairman. Yes, a chairman is not your everyday person. But then what effective agenda does he have that will change the way the world looks at everything? Not only just the way it looks at Africa, not only the way it looks at global peace, global trade, climate change, but what can we do that the world will stop and say, the global South is talking, the non-aligned movement is talking, we need to give them an ear.
You raise a very important point there, which is around financial dependence. Dima, one of the big issues on the table has been about trying to reform the financial architecture, the international financial architecture. And I'm wondering what that looks like in the eyes of the non-aligned movement. How do you go about doing that? And what is the vision for that?
Listen, there has been a lot of discussions around the reform of the financial architecture due to the debt relief need for all the countries of the South. There is an ongoing discussion that is happening, and G77 have been amplifying that voice, and I'm sure that the non-aligned movement have been doing the same. I came here for the South Summit, and I know very much that the G77, who are the architects behind this discussion, have been pursuing that. There is a serious discussion at the UN, also spearheaded by other entities. There is a whole report that has been produced by UNDESA with a trigger from UN Secretary General for that. there is a need also using South-South cooperation to learn from experiences of other countries. There are countries that have been trying to look at different models to relieve that indebtedness. And this is something that we are trying to pursue with them in terms of knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange. I think the financial architecture reform will take its time, and it will be also subject to a lot of discussions, and the G77 and China are playing a major role in amplifying and relaying the message of the countries of the South in this respect.
So we've been talking a lot here about what the non-aligned movement wants: reform at the United Nations, reform of the global financial architecture. You raised a question, Nicholas, about the power that these countries actually have to change anything. Endy, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. How does the non-aligned movement get what it wants? And right now, is there an opportunity here, as we see increasing great power competition, when we see the divergence of views when it comes to the war in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on, as you were talking about there, the second Cold War between the US and China, given that there are potentially sides to take here, is there power in not taking one? And does that raise the relevance and the profile of the non-aligned movement right now?
Yes, I think when it comes to great power rivalry, I think the non-aligned movement is the perfect forum to provide an alternative for countries who do not want to be aligned with one of the two powers. But on the question of economic dependence, I think the global South also now counts some of the rising economies. And in fact, some of them are now members of the G20. In fact, in the chairmanship of G20 in 2022 was Indonesia, last year was India, this year is Brazil, and the next year will be South Africa. So 4 countries from the global South are actually now leading the G20, and I think this is where they can use their leverage. And I understand that all these 4 countries, when they speak at the G20 summits, they always bring the voice of the global South. So there's hope because in the global South, there are countries that are now emerging economies with more leverage. BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now plus 5 new members, they're also pressing for changes in the global financial system. So there's also pressure, and I guess they represent the global South. And at the COP summit on climate change, Indonesia and many other countries are pressing the rich countries to do their share, to disburse aid for countries to help them cope with climate change. So there's a lot of pressures, and there's a lot of organizations, whether multilateral or regional, that are putting pressure and representing the interests of the global South.
Endy, you mentioned BRICS there. In addition to the countries that you mentioned, obviously Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, we now have Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE joining. Obviously, it's not considered non-aligned. You have Russia in there, you have China in there, you have Iran in there as well. I'm wondering about how we're seeing this global order being shaped by these different blocs. Nicholas, let me throw this one to you. Do you see these blocs, these emerging blocs, do you see them getting stronger and therefore having more power to push the agenda that you've been talking about? You've talked about desires for change, but questioned whether or not there is actually the power to do it.
Thank you very much. If we are talking about the long run, yes, if we are consistent on the issue on 2 issues: 1, strengthening governance, and 2, building these economies so that they become viable economies. Economies that are highly indebted are always going to be very fragile. They end up with weak and failed states. Because one of the things about the global South, and especially the majority in that is the African countries. The African continent has such a young population. Now, a young population without employment, productivity is low. The end result is that you're going to have issues to do with security, And because people have to survive, we can't just lecture them. So when you have weak states, it is very, very difficult for them to be taken seriously. And that's why the thinking about very many people is that before we even go into all this, we must think about what do we do about strengthening economies in the global south. And one of the things that you should know is that it is in the global south, because the majority are really African countries, the 55 or so, the 52 or so. We have some of the most important resources, natural resources that are on demand globally. Look at the Congo and so on.
So I have a very brief question for Endy, just picking up on what you were saying there. Obviously, there's a lot of resources, a lot of potential in a lot of the countries that we're talking about. And we've seen great powers try to woo a lot of these countries, not only economically, but also politically. And some might argue that the narrative from the West really recently has been about democracy versus autocracy. So, Endy, just very briefly, let me ask you, is that working?
Well, I mean, there's definitely problems within many countries in the global south with regards to democracy or lack of it. And they need to address this, irrespective of pressure from the West. Because at the end of the day, like Nicolas says, it's about governance. And that seems to be a big problem in many of the countries in the global south. They need to address, we need to address this definitely, and to be able to stand and negotiate with other countries, addressing all the problems like debts, climate change, foreign aid, development, all those things. They need to happen, but we need to have good governance in all the countries in the global south. I guess that's the biggest challenge.
All of you. Huge challenges ahead, but we'll leave it there for now. Thank you to all of our guests, Nicolas Sengoba, Endy Bayuni and Dima Al-Khatib, and thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.